If you're new to the podcast, or maybe you just missed when I've talked about this, my brother-in-law recently passed away from ALS, which is also called Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a rare neurological disease that affects the nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord that control voluntary muscle movement. To say that it's been difficult is an understatement, and finding a new normal has been incredibly humbling and challenging. So, in honor of National Grief Awareness Day, which is tomorrow, I decided to do an episode about different podcasts about grief that may be helpful for other people who are also trying to figure out how to live with grief. Hi, I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. I help moms find podcasts for themselves and their kids that are a good fit. Before I give you my recommendations, I just wanted to remind you that if you are dealing with any sort of grief, you are not alone. And seeking outside help from friends and family or from a mental health professional does not make you weak, it makes you smart. Okay, on to my recommendations. The first podcast about grief on my list for today is called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. Grief expert and psychotherapist Megan Devine is the host, and she has thoughtful, fascinating, and relatable conversations with all types of people who struggle with all of the many different ways grief can manifest itself. In the description of the podcast, she says, maybe not your typical dinner party topics, but none of us are entirely okay, and it's time we start talking about that. One of the episodes that I found helpful was the episode called Real Self-Care with Dr. Pooja Lakshman. In the episode, the conversation revolves around self-care, what it is and what it isn't, and how one of the main keys of self-care is boundaries. I'll make sure to link that episode in the show notes. The next podcast on this list is Griefcast. In the description of the podcast, host Carrie Lloyd, a British comedian and actress, says, we're all in this club that no one asked to join, and it's really helpful when you realize there's other people in the club. Part of grief is feeling quite isolated, so when you realize, oh, it's not just me, it does help. Each episode is a conversation with a wide range of people who share stories about loved ones they've lost. Listening to the show is getting to hear real people as they talk about their grief, the sad parts, but also the funny and weird parts. If you're looking for a place to start, I recommend starting with the episode with Ed Byrne, who talks about losing his younger brother 3 months before the recording of the episode. The grief is raw and fresh and very relatable. I'll make sure to put a link to it in the show notes. Okay. Before we talk about more podcasts that can help us deal with grief, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my podcast consultations. I've been able to talk to some amazing podcasters about their shows while doing interviews for the Friendly Podcast Guide. And along the way, I've learned so many tips and tricks on how to start a podcast from the hosts I've interviewed and from personal experience. I've talked to those hosts about what made their launch successful and what made it more difficult, and I for sure know what I would do differently if I could go back and launch my show again. And now I want to share my knowledge with you. I'm offering podcast consults, and I have a couple of spots open in the next month. If you need help nailing down your podcast idea, figuring out your niche, or you have any other podcast questions, I would love to work with you to make your show's launch the best it can be. If you're interested in working with me, fill out the intake form in the show notes. I can't wait to make a podcast plan that is tailored to you and your podcast and will make your launch as smooth and successful as possible. Okay, back to my recommendations. Another podcast about grief on the list for today is called Terrible. Thanks for asking. You know how we very often get asked, how are you? And usually, instead of getting into the nuances of how we are actually feeling, we just say, fine. Well, on this show, the host Nora McInerney and guests get honest about how they're really doing. It's sometimes sad, sometimes funny, and almost always both. This podcast does have some language, so just keep that in mind when you're listening. An interesting episode that you could start with is called Nora Needs a New Dad. Just as a reminder, Nora is the host. This is how the Terrible, Thanks for Asking team describes this episode. Nora's dad died in 2014 from pretty much all of the cancers, leaving her mom, Margaret, without her life partner of almost 50 years, and leaving Nora without a dad. Does a 40-year-old married woman with 4 children of her own need a father figure in her life? Nora thinks so. But what does Margaret have to say about dating in your 70s? I couldn't describe that episode in any other way. That's why I used their description. And the episode is just as interesting and fun and fascinating of a listen as that description is. I'll make sure to put a link in the show notes. The last podcast about grief on today's list is called What's Your Grief? It's hosted by two mental health professionals, Eleanor Haley and Litza Williams, who are working to demystify the complicated and messy world of living life after loss. In the description of the show, they say, grief is sad and confusing, but your grief support doesn't have to be. These hosts have a great rapport with one another, and when you listen, you feel like you're in the middle of a conversation with two very smart, emotionally mature friends that want to help you live your best life. One recent episode that I found very helpful is called When Grief Meets Anxiety. It's about how normal anxiety can go wonky when mixed with grief, and how to work through that. I'll make sure to put a link for the episode in the show notes. Preparing for this episode was actually quite healing for me as I worked through some of my own feelings around my brother-in-law's death while listening to each of these podcasts. I hope you also found some podcasts that can help you on your own journey with grief. Talk to you soon. So if you can't tell, this podcast episode has definitely been a labor of love. It was hard to write, hard to record, and now hard to edit. And I knew that it was going to be hard for me to edit, just lots of emotions, lots of feelings. And so I gave myself a little pep talk that I forgot about while I was recording it, and it seriously made my day. So I figured y'all can hear it too. Good job, future Andy. You're editing great.